I just would like to say that I'm really very happy to have that we have this public conversation with Carolyn, and just explain in a few words why. It was, I think, maybe 5, 6, or maybe 7 years ago that I first became aware of the work of Carolyn, that while reading a little book by Pablo Servigne. Pablo Servigne is a Belgian environmental thinker and activist who was soon after to launch the field of collapsology, at least in French-speaking countries, but whose background is, probably unsurprisingly, agronomy and, or say, agroecology. And before publishing his now quite famous handbook on collapsology called Comment tout peut s'effondrer, how everything might collapse, surveying all the fields in which collapses might happen, including sanitary issues. Servigne had thus published another little book called Comment nourrir l'Europe en temps de crise, how to feed Europe in times of crisis. A study of the necessary transition or transformation of our agro-systems, which was, if I remember well, commissioned by the UN when Olivier de Schutter was the United Nations special rapporteur on the right to food, and as such, strongly promoted a politics of agroecology. Anyway, in this excellent little book, Servigne referred repeatedly to another book published a few years before, in 2008, by an English architect. And I was surprised, I didn't know the book at the time, a book which he strongly recommended for both its depth of thinking on these issues, but also its elegance, its humor, and its wit. So it was irresistible. And this is how I came to read Hungry City, how food shapes our lives. And here I was stunned. Here was indeed an excellent book, very enlightening, extremely well crafted, structured, textured, written, which looked at the evolution of cities and territories since the late Neolithic up to today, through the lens of food. That is, through all the major steps of the whole food process. Its cultivation and production, chapter 1, the land. Its transportation, chapter 2, supplying the city. Its exchange and acquisition, chapter 3, market and supermarket. Its preparation and transformation, chapter 4, the kitchen. Its consumption and the rituals of the meals, chapter 5, at table, all the way to its throwing away into dumps, chapter 6, waste. So what this book made extremely clear, at least to me, was the cultural, the critical importance of all these steps and their correlated evolutions, if we are to understand the evolution of our territories, environments, and worlds. And this whole journey led to a seventh and ultimate chapter. For Carolyn, a book is obviously a kind of Holy Week, in a way. It's funny because I was just reminded, thinking that we also actually have a structure or exhibition in 6+1 section, all made of 7 vignettes. So we share, maybe it's an influence, we share deep interest for the magic of number 7. So it led to that kind of Sunday, already entitled Sitopia, from sitos, food, and topos, place, in which you treated your readers to a reflection on precisely that, the fundamental correlation that exists between caring for food through all these steps and managing places, that is, building and stewarding decent territories, environments, societies, and worlds. And now, 12 years after extended and intense pregnancy, you just delivered a new book, Sitopia, that expands the Sunday of your previous book into a new Holy Week of reflection, this time focused on exploring and delineating the philosophical and political basis and inspirations of this Sitopian vision. And here, the seventh chapter, again, the seventh chapter of the book do not stand for the successive phases of the metabolism of food, but rather for the different scales at which you explore your subject. First, food itself. Second, body. Third, home. Fourth, society, which is right at the center of the book. Then, city and country, fifth chapter. Sixth chapter, nature. And finally, 7, time. So we'll go back to that. But my first question, I mean, could you tell us a few words first and explain how an architect and a practicing architect embarked into this journey on food and its correlation to places?
Well, thank you very much for your very kind words. And I actually didn't know how you came across my book. If you told me before, I've forgotten, but it's very interesting to hear. And many thanks to Cyril for inviting us here as well. My answer to that question normally takes about half an hour, and given that half an hour is how long we've got, we've already taken at least 7 minutes. I will try to make this very brief. In short, I wanted to be an architect since as early as I can remember, so probably the age of 6 or 7. I have no idea where this came from. There are no architects in my family, but nevertheless, I became one. And I think really as soon as I started studying architecture, I had this feeling that there was something about my interest in architecture that was not coming at me through the formal teaching. And I'm going to cut out about sort of 20 years of agony now in my story. But basically, I was searching for what it was that interested me about buildings and about architecture. And in the end, I came to the conclusion that it was something to do with our relationship with buildings. But as I said, it took me many, many years to find this out. And so I was searching for a way of really, I guess, introducing the human into the architectural discourse. And I had this moment, I mean, I know exactly where I was. It was in April 2000, in conversation with a colleague from the London School of Economics, where I'd gone to teach, that I had the idea of describing a city through the lens of food. And this was like the biggest light bulb in my life going off, because I'd always used food in my projects, because by then I'd been teaching architecture for a long time, and I always gave students food to design with, because I knew that if they did that, they immediately understood much better. They could intuitively inhabit the building, if you see what I mean. And it struck me that, you know, if you think about the problem of how to live as a human, you know, there's sustenance on the one hand and there's dwelling on the other. I mean, it is almost the kind of the missing half of the question of how to live a good life. And anyway, I mean, as you very kindly said, I mean, I've got literally the original copy of Hungry City here. I mean, this is the first one I ever held in my hand. And, you know, within a week, I had the structure that you just described, but, you know, the idea of the journey of food through the city, because, you know, it just struck me that, you know, the first thing we intuitively do if we go somewhere is go to a market. You know, you just intuitively want to go there because it's where real life is being lived. But, you know, very few of us ever ask the question of where did that food actually come from? You know, and I often say food is like a sort of an emissary from another landscape and another world, you know, because it is physically connecting you to a place that could be thousands of miles away. And all the people along that journey who've touched it or who've processed it or taken care of it or transported it and so on. So as an architect, that seemed like a very obvious structure to just follow the journey of food through the city. And as you say at the end, having realized, you know, that through my research, that really the question of how you feed a city, or, you know, is the same as saying, what is civilization? You know, it's kind of ridiculously big. And I often say food is one of those things that's too big to see because it shapes our lives in so many ways. But if you then take this thing of food, you know, that's everywhere, it's, you know, shaping everything, our bodies, our homes, our habits, our cities, our landscapes, and so on, and you stick it here, and you look through it, then that's an incredibly powerful lens through which to not only see the world, but also to ask a whole load of really, really important questions, like what is a good life? And I don't know whether now would be a good time to sort of explain how I got onto inventing the word Sitopia.
Please do.
Okay. Well, as you say, I mean, the final chapter in Hungry City is called Sitopia, and that was very, very late in the day, actually, that it came, because what had happened was I was, you know, each chapter in the book, I began with a snapshot of now, you know, and then I kind of went on a long historical journey saying, how did we get here? And then I finished up with sort of saying, okay, what are we going to do about it, if you like? So I'd had the journey of food, and I'd ended up, as you say, in the waste dump. So I'd been from the land back to the land. And in the final chapter, I thought, okay, this has to sort of sum up what we've learned. And I thought, well, what is, as it were, a kind of a historical equivalent of, you know, a snapshot of, you know, thinking in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live, which is what I sort of realized by then food actually allows us to do. So I began researching utopia. And I discovered two things. The first thing was that utopians talk endlessly about food, but they talk about it in little sort of fragments. So they sort of worry about how big a city should be because it can feed itself, or what the relationship with the landscape should be, or who should farm, or all this kind of things. And the second thing I discovered is that utopia can't exist because the U in utopia is a joke word. It can either mean from EU, a good place, or from OU, no place. So utopias, if you like, our greatest discipline of thinking in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live, but it can't exist. And I remember feeling really depressed about this. And then I thought, but actually what I've discovered through 6 years of researching this book is that food shapes everything. You know, food is the great connector. So we live in a, you know, a place that, you know, a food place. And I phoned some friends of mine up who are very sort of, you know, at the top of, they teach other people how to teach ancient Greek in this country. They're the next best thing I could have got to actually talking to an ancient Greek. And I said, if you were going to be an ancient Greek and you were going to invent a word that means food place, what would that word be? And they said, well, sitos is the Greek word for food, and topos is a Greek word for place. So it would be Sitopia. But that kind of sounds ridiculous. So, you know, even though it's not the rules, you would probably just call it Sitopia. And that's, you know, basically I invented the word to be a kind of practical, doable alternative to utopia, because we already live in Sitopia. We just live in the bad one because we don't value food, and we don't even know that we live in one. But if we start valuing food and understanding that the whole world is shaped by food, then it becomes a practical alternative to utopia that we can actually use to shape a better world. So that, hence the funny Greek word that I came up with.
Yeah. So as an alternative to utopia, and in Sitopia, the book now, and I would like to go right into the nave of the book, that's chapter 4 and 5 on society and city and countryside. Here in these two chapters, you go into a long way into reviving traditions of thought that, according to you, have gone very, very close to what you're trying to describe under that name, Sitopia. And you evidence among those people a strong contribution of anarchism. And but it's interesting. It was the same in the exhibition that I slowly realized, reading text and after text, how important the contribution of anarchists had been to ecology. And those, of course, this issue of self-sufficiency. Could you say a few words about that? How what you find in anarchist tradition of thinking, where you say it maybe time has come maybe for anarchy now.
Yeah, I mean,
could you...
before I answer that question directly, I just would like to share a little drawing with you. I mean, I'm just going to do it on the screen. It's a terrible drawing anyway, but it is simply the drawing from which the book Sitopia came.
Yeah.
I'm trying to work out where food sits in our world. And I just kind of drew a plate of food, a table around the food, people around the table, sharing, connection, you know, a cook figure, love, you know, nurturing, gratitude, question mark. So that becomes the space of the home. You know, where did the food come from? It comes from a market. So you get trust, knowledge, economy. Where does the market sit? In the city. Where does the city sit? In the countryside. Where does the countryside sit? In nature. Where does nature sit? In the universe. I mean, you know, that it's that. So the book structure is, if you like, I mean, this is very architecty, but it's a kind of section through that drawing. Because, as you rightly said, from food to the body, the home, society, city and country, nature and time. Now, the reason it's important for me to say that is because everything, when you're thinking about food, and I was trying to mirror this in the book, everything is linked to everything else. Food is like the ultimate sort of systems thinking thing. And I've never studied systems thinking, by the way, but people keep telling me I'm a systems thinker, because you can't not be if you think through food. So you're interestingly, you're picking up, you know, kind of this bit. I mean, actually, I've got another really awful drawing to show you. These are awful drawings because they were the original drawings that I did when I was thinking. This is the structure of the book, as I said, from food, which is life, to time, as you say, so that's the universe on the plan, which is death. And in fact, they meet round the back, because life and death are part of the same thing. So it's a kind of three-dimensional drawing. And then the body, which mirrors nature. And you know, so each chapter, I was asking, how can we use the lens of food to ask what is a good life? So clearly, in these early chapters, I'm saying, well, food is life. So if we treat it as cheap, that explains why we're so screwed up. You know, what is the problem with the body? Well, we've evolved a world that is not good for our bodies. So we've turned evolution on its head. You know, what's the problem with home? I obviously can't explain everything because that would take as long as it took to write the book. Home, but I am going to answer your question in a second. Home used to be a place where you fed yourself, basically. Now we live in cities, it's a place where you get fed by somebody else. And as you rightly say, the whole thing hinges around society in the middle. And these chapters, these late chapters, are like answers, are like echoes of the early ones, because I realized about 4 years into writing the book that it's symmetrical. So as I say, food and life is mirrored by time, which is there. The body out of sync, body back in sync in nature. Home, we've become sort of dispossessed of home, what it used to be. So it needs to be re-embedded, and it all comes down to how we share. So, okay, the anarchists, they are trying to ask from basic principles what a good life is, which basically, you know, all political philosophers are doing. They identified a problem, well, a kind of unhelpful polarization, if you like, between capitalism on the one hand and communism on the other hand. And they were trying to kind of steer a course down the middle. And what I came to the anarchists through The Garden City, because Peter Kropotkin was a very big influence on Ebenezer Howard. And what Ebenezer Howard is trying to do, and I'm sorry, there are so many things to say, I'll just cram it all in. Ebenezer Howard is trying to solve the fundamental problem of how to create a good dwelling. And here I have to use Aristotle's term, which I think is a brilliant term for understanding our dilemma. He calls us political animals. And the importance of that term is that there's a dualism, because we're political, which means we need each other, which means we need to cluster together in society, but we're animals, which means we also need nature. So what is the ideal habitat for a political animal? Well, it's kind of with one foot in the city and one foot in the countryside, if you like, you know. So many utopians through history have tried to solve this dilemma. They haven't necessarily put it in those terms. Of course, Plato and Aristotle put it precisely in those terms, because they talked about economia, which is the idea of the city staying small and staying close to the countryside. So to come back to the anarchists, and again, I mean, the key anarchist for Howard was Peter Kropotkin. Basically, what Kropotkin was saying is that the problem with capitalism, well, it's all to do with property, of course, and it's all to do with who owns what. But also the problem with capitalism and the division of labour, which is the whole principle around which it's built, is that it tries to generate wealth in society by treating human beings like cogs in a wheel. And he said, surely it's the other way around. Surely the whole point of society is to create happy humans, and therefore wealth is not to be a cog in a wheel. Wealth is to do with being able to express yourself as fully as possible as a human. And for him, this meant, growing potatoes in the morning and making, furniture in the afternoon and writing poetry in the evening. In other words, doing lots of things, not just being someone who stuck the head on top of a pin, a la Adam Smith.
Mm-hmm.
So when that becomes a kind of a spatial proposition, it becomes, what he calls fields, factories, and workshops. In other words, it's a landscape where you get production of food and production of other things, manufacturing, coexisting. So it then becomes a problem, as I also say, sorry, there's many things linked up as usual. The maximization of the urban-rural interface is what I have called it. Yeah. This idea that rich people through history have always chosen to have a place in the country and a place in the city because they can afford it. That is the ideal. Mm. I mean, by the way, I live in central London, and during lockdown, my entire street's empty. So that tells me how many people in my street have second homes. They've all totally ignored the government advice and gone and lived in the country, because that's what we do in a crisis. And that's also interesting. Anyway, so, but of course, most people can't afford to have a place in the country and a place in the city. So what people like, Ebenezer Howard were trying to do is try to create he called it his town country magnet. Mm-hmm. So you limit the size of a city and you surround it by countryside. And this means that the city can be self-sufficient, but it also means that people living in the city are never too far away from nature, because that's a fundamental need to us. And again, it's very interesting talking to people in lockdown in various places who don't have a garden, who are saying, it's terrible, I need to go outside. It's a very, very physical need for us humans. So that was one aspect of why I thought the anarchists are really interesting. And the other was the idea of who owns what. So they're clearly against private property ownership. Mm-hmm. And I know you're interested in asking me about Henry George.
Yes, because you say at some point in the book, you say, what I will quote you, what we need is a modern version of the polis, Greek city concept, minus the patriarchy and slaves. Such a society would be based on oikonomia, as you just said, and would be green, resilient, democratic, and egalitarian. It's pretty clear what we need. What's much less obvious, you say, is how to get there. And you have an idea of how to get there. Not maybe, you say, if I understand you well, a complete revolution that might do I don't know what, but there is another way there, and you refer to Henry George idea of taxing land value. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, so where I got to through the work that it took to write Sitopia, which took 8 years. It's a big book, as you say. Well, it's not big physically, actually. In fact, I'm very proud of the fact that it's ever so slightly smaller than Hungry City, which I never thought was possible. Anyway, but so that's just the thing writers obsess about. But basically, I guess I came to the point where I thought the best possible metaphor that we can have for a good society is one in which everyone eats well, because we all have to eat. And, for me, the best metaphor of society is the shared table, because we're very, very good at sharing through food. And I often say, compare how we share through food to how we share through money. If you're sitting at a table with strangers or friends, it doesn't matter who, you don't go, oh, lovely, lovely, I'll have all the pies for myself, thank you very much. You just don't do that. But that's exactly what we do with money, which is really interesting. So having had this idea, the question is, okay, how do you create a society where everybody eats well? Well, clearly, there's a direct correlation between food and land. Food comes from the land, you know, and it's very interesting if you read, you know, sort of the political philosophers going back in history, they all begin with the land. You know, Adam Smith begins with the land, the physiocrats start with the land, you know, they all do, because it's sort of obvious, really. And there's clearly a point at which, you know, ownership becomes possible. And I mean, again, I go in great length in the book into how the capitalist system sort of was founded on John Locke's argument, you know, in the 17th century, that basically if you till the land, if you work on the land, then you have a right to own it outright. And basically this is the basis, you know, this then becomes sort of, if you like, incorporated in the agrarian vision of you know, a liberal society, if you like, that then gets adopted in America because there's plenty of land going, and then sort of gets married with the capitalist idea. So it's based on property, and this is what the anarchists are identifying as a problem. So Proudhon, for example, says, you know, capitalism is based on possession, you know, and he said, you know, proprietorship, and basically this is unfair because, you know, nobody's born owning anything. I mean, Locke knew that, by the way, but Locke said, as long as you only take as much land as it takes to feed you and no more, then that's what you deserve to own. And so there's plenty of logic to that. But I mean, the problem is, of course, that nobody ever sticks to the amount of land that they only need, you know, and this is, I mean, again, long story, but I mean, basically all the rhetoric of capitalism is based on the agrarian principle, in which land is basically the basis of wealth. But then, sort of by stealth, as it were, money replaces land. So the rhetoric stays the same, but the basis of it completely disappears, because money doesn't exist. Money is a fiction. Money is a sort of totally fluid thing. Yeah. So anyway, lots of things come out of it, but specifically with respect to Henry George, what Henry George saw, I mean, Henry George lived in San Francisco, which he said was a lovely place until railways came, and then the railways totally ruined it. And the reason, he wrote this very important book called Progress and Poverty, and basically he said when the railways came to San Francisco, some people got very, very rich overnight, and they weren't necessarily the people who were building the railway or indeed anything to do with it, but they just randomly happened to own a piece of land close to where the railway came, which suddenly got extremely expensive. So he really repeated what the anarchists like Proudhon was saying, which is that actually nobody should own land outright, but the society should own land. You know, and we do, we all, you know, we inherit the earth together. Even Locke said that, by the way. I mean, you know, so nobody has the right to own land. But of course, we need to use it. You know, if you're a farmer, you need the use of a piece of land. So the idea comes again from Proudhon, one of the anarchists, the father of anarchism, if you like, that, okay, if you want to use that piece of land, then you pay society a rent for it, basically. So ultimately it belongs to society, but I'm just going to use it for a bit. What Henry George did is he said, okay, you know, the people who suddenly got rich because somebody built a railway next to their plot of land, they should then pay society a higher rent for that land, because society owns the land. They have sole use of it because, I don't know, they're you know, they built a house on it or whatever, or a hotel. It's become more expensive through no kind of virtue of theirs. So they should pay a rent for it to society. And this, interestingly, was another idea that Ebenezer Howard incorporated in his Garden City. So, I mean, it's a brilliant, brilliant idea, I think, because you can adjust it. So you can say, okay, pay 80% of the increase in value. It doesn't have to be all of it. But what it does is it has the effect of neutralizing the extreme sort of contrast of a piece of land in central London, you know, the value of that as opposed to a piece of land in, you know, the Hebrides. And it means that there's an incentive to densify cities, and there's also an incentive, basically farmland remains affordable to farmers, which is also something very desirable. So I think it's a really interesting model. And just one other thing to say, which is really important, is that, you know, I think, you know, the situation in which we find ourselves now is that, you know, we share the global village and we're all in it together, environmentally, economically, and so on. And I think a lot of the ideas around the sharing of commons are becoming all very, very important again. And if you look at, I mean, somebody like Elinor Ostrom, who was a sort of Nobel Prize winning researcher into what works when people share the commons well, and she totally, by the way, debunked the tragedy of the commons, which I think is really interesting. She basically said what you need is agency at the smallest level possible. So basically, if it's a village, they get to decide who uses the duck pond or whatever. And then you have nested governance above it. So basically, if people are misbehaving, the first action should happen at village level. And then if that doesn't work, there is a higher authority you can go to. And it just strikes me that globally, what we need is more local and regional agency, and also more, much, much tougher global agency of some kind. And I think COVID as well is really, really highlighting this. So all of these ideas linked together, the way people actually behave in terms of managing, resources, and the way, the economics and the politics work, I think they all need to come together. And as I say, food is just something that, yet again, it brings them all together in a way that becomes quite easy to sort of to see the connections. So that's
okay. So Cyril tells me that there are questions from. we can accept questions from the people.
Thank you very much. I don't want to interrupt such an interesting presentation. I understand that you can talk for hours. Well, first I want to say that you show, Carolyn, how your book is very well structured in your drawing, which was difficult to see on the screen, but still we understood very well the idea. But it's also very well written. It's a book that you can read it with real pleasure. Like I said, you read it like a novel. And of course, with this topic that is so important for us. But at the beginning of your book, you focus on the technology. It's one of the first chapter, maybe the first chapter. And you quote Cedric Price, technology is the answer, and what is the question? And it's, I think this is maybe the common point between you and Sebastien. This is the reason why you also appreciate your work a lot. I think, Sebastien, also you are very worried about the technology and this technological solution to deal with urbanism, with environment, with agriculture, and Carolyn with food. And I wanted to ask you, so it's a question to both of you, Sebastien and Carolyn, are you really you're suspicious about technology, or is it a warning? I understand that nobody wants to eat artificial food, but still there is a lot of maybe solutions that are in this food technology.
Shall I go first?
As you like.
Well, I just to say thank you for those lovely words, by the way, Cyril, about the book. And just to say, which I haven't already, that when I met Sebastien and when I saw the Taking the Countryside exhibition, it was a really out-of-body experience, because some of it was really familiar because obviously I was in the mix as well, but some of it was not in Hungry City. And I said to Sebastien at the time, it's really, really weird, because it's like we've been occupying parallel mental universes, And I think this is what so many of the things that are in Sebastien's exhibition are also in Sitopia, and it's very, very heartwarming and reassuring to see that. And I think I know the reason why, and that comes directly to your question. I love that quote from Cedric Price. I mean, Cedric Price is a wonderful architect in Britain who didn't really build very much because he was too good at asking questions, I would say. And clearly, if technology is the answer, what was the question? The question has to be something along the lines of what is a good life? And I think what's become very clear to me, again, through thinking through food for as long as I've been thinking, is that, food is so fundamental. We wouldn't exist without it. None of us would be here without it. And the fact that we've for so long treated us as cheap, something that should be cheap, which it clearly can't be. There is no such thing as cheap food. It's so clear at showing you the sort of the value schisms, you know, the sort of the really, really sort of upside down values that we live by. So I love food for that reason, but I love it also for the fact that it allows you to ask really big questions. You know, I'm an architect by training. I would never have had the, you know, the gall, the sort of the cheek to call myself a philosopher. But by thinking through food and really asking what is food, where does it come from, who deserves to eat well, it makes you a philosopher. So it holds your hand and it's an incredible guide, you know, through the world. And in terms of the technology question, I think I often say that technology is like a dog, you know, that you take on a walk. I mean, it's really, really useful because, you know, the dog can kind of, you know, it can sniff out stuff and it's a companion and it can entertain you and it can do really useful stuff. You know, it can defend you and it can leap over rocks and help you and so on. But it's fine as long as the dog's on a lead and you remember you're the master. You know, as soon as you let the dog off the lead and you start following the dog, you're in trouble because, you know, technology is a tool. It's not, and I find it really interesting in the UK at the moment, for example, the politicians keep saying, oh, we're following the science, you know, as if that's kind of like some just, you know, clear path. And then the scientists say, no, you're not. We're giving you science, but you're making the decisions. You know, so we have to remember this relationship, I think. And I think in our modern world, because our technology is so extraordinary, I mean, just look at what we're doing now. I mean, it's just insane, isn't it, that we can do this? We tend to get blinded by it and think, oh, it's so amazing. So, you know, when it's Google burgers, you know, let's make meat in a lab. There's a tendency to sort of want simple answers to things and to think technology can deliver simple answers. And so that's why in the introduction to my book, I just had this section where I basically said, you know, I think we've got amazing technology, but we're really lagging in the philosophy department. So for me, the major crisis that we have as a society is philosophical, it's not technological.
Yeah, and you start
over to Sebastien.
And you start your book by that anecdote there. No, I obviously completely share. You quote that famous sentence at some point that when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Yeah, exactly.
When you have a technology, you try to find the questions precisely. It's like the Cedric Price thing that correspond to the technology you want to apply anyway. So, and you have beautiful pages about that. And it's true that it's very weird because we had the exact same. We felt the exact same annoying things in certain authors, like Stuart Brown, for instance. Yeah. Stuart Brown, who published in 2008 or 7, just like Hungry City, this book, the Whole Earth Discipline, when all of a sudden this guy who was the pope of decentralization, of fleeing the consumer society, after years of being a counselor to big companies, now becomes an advocate of concentration, of high-tech stuff, which is for him the only way out of our predicament. It's very, very, very weird how people who, I mean, he's a bright guy, and the book is kind of beautifully written, also pretty convincing, and you have to really take the arguments, but who all of a sudden sees nothing else possible, no other way possible that diving into the tech. It's certainly Carolyn has a beautiful sentence in her chapter on nature, the 6th chapter, where she says, we live in a perplexing, perilous, exhilarating times that call for bold ideas, strong and steady heads. Extraordinary new technology will undoubtedly bring us remarkable capacities in the future, but without similarly daring and innovative, I would discuss the problem of innovation, innovative social, economic, and spatial evolution, they will be worse than useless. I share that completely.
question from Bellarmino Salvador Barata that maybe is coming back to politics, one part of the discussion of tonight. The first decree of the Soviet power was on the land and on peace. Would you comment according to this expose? I don't know if you want some explanation of the question, and if Bellarmino, you want to...
Please.
Okay.
Who's talking now? Should I?
Yes, well, without being, it crossed my mind during your introduction, very, very interesting, about all these tensions between money and land and countryside and city, and the need for society and for political change. So it occurred for me that it's historical a fact that one of the first decrees of the new organization, the new kind of power, was on land, precisely. So I would like to listen from Carolyn, his comment on that, as she talked about the anarchists.
Yes.
If it's a kind of the feeling of the time when those revolutions were possible.
Yes.
And probably now today the revolution will be different.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a really, really interesting question. I mean, what I didn't really say very clearly is that, Proudhon, who writes this very amazing 60-page essay, which I think should be on every school curriculum, and it's just called "What is Property?"
Yes, c'est du vol.
Exactly, and so I sort of basically I spoke about the capitalist side, but I didn't really speak about the communist side. I mean, in essence, what he says is, and by the way, I mean, I say in the book, if you read the Communist Manifesto, you basically just want to rush out and sign up. I mean, it makes absolute perfect sense all the way through. The flaw in it, that Proudhon identified, this is why Marx used to always kind of argue with him, is that what the communists do is they say, yes, the people can be on the land and it's all coming down to the land, but then everything is owned by the state. And it's the fact that the state becomes the new proprietor, effectively. And that's what the anarchists are trying to get away from. And this stuff is really complicated and it's really difficult. But I mean, in essence, I think people need access to land. And I think we, as humans, need as much access to land now as any human ever did in history. And I think our need for land, I mean, again, COVID-19 is so interesting at sort of revealing what we need as humans. We cannot be cooped up in a flat, for 6 weeks without going bonkers, basically. So, and I also think, and it goes into other things as well. So the communists had many things right. It's just that the solutions go wrong because the state basically can't deliver. It can't deliver. It's too monolithic and it's too open to corruption and so on. So you have to stay nimble. And I think that's one of the really interesting insights from the anarchists. But I also, my formulation for this is the question we should be asking as designers is, what does a landscape for human flourishing look like? And I think the anarchists got quite close to that because, it was saying, as I said earlier, that, we need society and we need nature. And how do you get both of those things? And just to say very briefly, and I'll hand over to Sebastien, this thing I come up with of maximizing the urban-rural interface, as I call it, can happen at any scale. So it can be a city in its region, and you can, there's lots of designs like Patrick Geddes' star shape or the fried egg of the city state and so on. But it can also happen at the scale of a kitchen, with a herb box on it, or a house with a garden, or a housing block with communal allotments. And so it goes and so it goes. So it's like a fractal in a way. It doesn't matter what scale you come to. That is what is important, is that as humans, we have access to society and nature. And the politics come out of that, really. And the anarchist politics seem to me to match that better than any other politics I've come across, which is why I say maybe their time has come.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just add something? Because it's interesting to see, I was struck to see, looking at the anarchist tradition, and you mentioned its influence through Kropotkin on Howard, but that has been a continued influence afterwards. In the work, for instance, of urbanists like Kevin Lynch, who were also saying many things very close to what you're saying now, through Christopher Alexander.
Yes.
Advocating right at the beginning of the pattern language, first pattern, you know, bioregions.
Yes.
Second pattern, or maybe 10th pattern, city fingers and everything. We should have no parks per se.
Yes.
We should not have no agriculture per se. Everything should be cultivated in some ways. And strangely enough, I mean, they have not been more successful for that aspect of their work than the anarchists themselves. Even though they are praised as like major theorists in the field of urbanism.
I mean, the key. Sorry. I talk a lot, so I don't want to interrupt you. But I mean, just to say the missing bit, I think, and what I'm trying to do with my slightly weird structure in Sitopia is to say that never forget that the question you're asking, the question is, what is a good life? And I think the trouble with a lot of these amazing, as you say, these amazing kind of, planning ideas or sort of conceptual ideas about what a city should be, is that they can't fight against. I mean, Howard himself discovered this when he was trying to do his garden city. You know, they can't fight against the capitalist idea of a good life, because that's totally an opposite thing. It's a different thing. It's about making money, and it's about moving away from the land, and so on and so on. So basically, if you ask what a good life is through the lens of food, you know, you actually turn a lot of that capitalist thinking on its head. And again, the irony of COVID-19 is many of the things we're being forced to do, and many of the things I'm arguing for in the book, which is living more in time, being more, you know, in the here and now, spending more time with people we love. It's all the stuff that people who are dying normally want to do. Because when you're dying, you realize what matters. And what matters is simple stuff. It's the people you love. It's being in a beautiful place. It's nature. It's living with the seasons. It's making stuff. It's meaning. And we need an idea of a good life that is based on these things, and not on running around like idiots, kind of going, oh my God, I've got to have a new handbag. You know, I mean, it just does not bring happiness. So for me, you're absolutely right. All these amazing models exist, but I think we need to bring them together in one place and to rethink our idea of a good life. And again, food is just a perfect vehicle for doing that. It's not the only one, but it makes the question of what a good life is concrete, because there it is in your plate of soup. You know, it's not, oh no, I've got to go off and be a philosopher, and oh, where is that in the library? It's there in your plate of soup. That is why it's powerful.
Right.
Thank you. I will take another question. I think we have an urgent question that has been written on the chat from Nassim Kaufman, who is wondering about the likeliness of such a nice agenda to actually turn possible. And Nassim is asking, somehow we are far away from world or very local governments, since the change needs to be quite fast. Is there scales or method through which one can think about a possibility to overcome inertia and not confront to an actual rapid collapse? And so I think, Nassim, you're welcome to add something to your question if you want, or to join the conversation.
Just to precise, it's not like, I think like I'm very convinced about what you have said, but there is the word need, like we need to do that, we need to do that. I think like somehow the world where I exercise as a young architect now is really a world where I think like my way of thinking is not the common way of thinking. It's very local, and somehow universities is kind of have blinders to the way we think, just because we are in small groups and very uniformly in terms of social economic background somehow. So I feel like there is I mean, I don't want to do like a popular culture reference, but there is this new movie called El Hoyo, like the platform, which is very like a very, very simple depiction on stratification of society with one table with food on it. And then if nobody shares, then it's nightmare. And somehow I feel like this is quite probable as a scenario, of course. And how do we make sure that this doesn't happen?
Mm. Well, I mean, it's a super important question, of course. And, you know, I think COVID-19 is really sort of, for me, it's like a crossroads. I mean, I think before this happened, I was, to be honest, not massively optimistic because there was so much momentum of the train. It was just careering in one direction. And it was in pursuit of this idea of a good life that is not a good life, that was destroying the planet and so on. Now, by some extraordinary, you know, happenstance, here we find ourselves doing all the things that Greta Thunberg was telling us to do because we have no choice. And this is really interesting. So I think the next 2 or 3 months are going to be absolutely critical. I think we will never in our lifetimes have a moment when, and thank you for the question, by the way, I should have said a really important question. We will never in our lifetimes again have a moment when how we think and act and talk in the next 2 or 3 months will have a greater effect on how the fate of our species plays out, you could say. And I think what we need to do is we need to say, and it's very interesting, I mean, apparently President Macron last night was saying France has to get more resilient and all of this kind of stuff. Now, that can go in one of 2 ways as well. It can become protectionist, of course. And I talk about this in the book quite a bit as well, the tension between protectionism on the one hand and openness and globalization on the other. But I think, and this is where this nested idea I think is really important comes in, I think many governments now will be seriously looking at how they can become more self-sufficient and resilient. But as I said before, it's very, very clear that we have to act globally as well. You know, not just, you know, for COVID, which is the immediate, you know, crisis, but of course the other crises that are even bigger that have been temporarily shoved off top billing, but you know, they are the real biggies. I'm hoping that the fact that COVID-19 is unignorable unless you're President Trump, you know, or Jair Bolsonaro, I mean, I'm hoping that the fact that for most sane humans, it's unignorable. And it's making us ask really big questions about how we recover as a, you know, basically as a global community. And also a recognition that if the global south doesn't get over COVID-19, then the global north can't go back to business as usual either. So it really is global. It's opening up a window to really say, okay, what could a good life, a practical good life look like going forward? And really bizarrely, all of the things that I think we already needed to do, and I'm arguing for in the book, they are part of the solution. So I think it's absolutely about making those arguments and reaching the politicians and saying, look, you know, this is how you could restructure. You know, for example, I mean, I've always argued we need a Ministry of Food. You know, I mean, it's coming quite close to that. You know, governments for a long time have left feeding people to the market. That's becoming less possible again. So I'm not saying, oh, it's going to be fine, it's going to happen, but I am saying there's a critical moment where the train's ground to a halt. When it goes again, do we just chug along, you know, and go the way we were going, or do we go here? And it'll never come again. So now is the time, and make the argument and just have the conversation with as many people as you can. Kind of write your MP, you know. Anyway, that's all I can say. It's I have hope. I have more hope, bizarrely, than I did 3 months ago.
And maybe if I can complete this amazing question about having a discussion with people, that we will have next week, have a discussion with Lausanne people about the question of agriculture and the local food system in Lausanne. So with the city, with agriculture, with cooperative. So I invite you all to join next week to continue this chat with more local thing. And I give back the question to the next question, so to Cyril.
Yes, thank you, Raphael. We can go to a question which goes to the space. It's Gabriela Jean Renaud. She she wanted to talk about the question of the commons. Could you talk more about the links between the agricultural land commons, especially speaking? I think it's a good question for an architect like you, Carolyn, but also Sebastien, this maybe goes to your 4 scenarios for the agriculture and urbanism for the people who have seen the exhibition. The question of the space, division of the space is asked, and Gabriela, you're welcome to add a comment or to continue the question if you want.
Sorry. No, I was just curious because I'm working on this question in my project, my master project. More specifically regarding the commons, not on the production chain, but more on the transformation chain of agriculture. So all the equipments that are necessary to, the transformation of the food. And I was just curious because you raised this question with the commons, related a bit with the economical issue, the land use, if I understood. But as an architect, how do you see this question especially? So it's very big, the question, but I'd like to know your position on that.
These are the spaces in which we can ask the big questions, and that's what's so wonderful about food again. And I do want to make space for Sebastien to answer this as well, because he did some really interesting work in the exhibition about it. Very, very briefly, you know, I think, as I say, we need land reform. You know, and every utopian in history has thought we need land reform, and very, very few of them have ever achieved it. And it's very difficult to get there, but it's quite interesting, for example, that the Green Party in the UK has a land value tax as part of its strategy. You know, so we just need to vote Green when we finally get rid of Boris, please. Anyway, so in terms of the commons, I mean, what's really interesting about it, and I base a lot of what I say on Eleanor Ostrom's work, so I don't know whether you're familiar with her work, Gabriela. Are you? Eleanor Ostrom's work. Are you familiar with it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, the work that she does, which is very specific, it's about, you know, a group of people managing a fish pond or a group of people managing a forest or something. But she comes up with this very, very sophisticated set of, things that need to be in place for it to work, you know. And what I love about it, and I think is really important about it, is that it puts agency at the most basic local level as possible, always. You know, and I think this is where we need to get, that's how it feeds into politics and economics for me. You know, basically, what we're seeing with COVID-19 is streets getting together and acting together. We've never seen this before at this level. You know, WhatsApp groups happening. So, I mean, you know, technology is helping as well. And people saying, what do you need? Let me help. Da, da, da. I'm assuming actually that after COVID-19, as we come out of it, these new connections are still going to be there. We're also seeing food networks forming overnight because, you know, the disruption in the food system means that all the cafes and restaurants have shut down. So many, many suppliers who only fed into that market, they're suddenly without a market. And very, very rapidly, what we're seeing developing is kind of new food networks where basically the call goes out, and it goes out on Twitter, and it goes out on, you know, various chat groups. You know, if you want to save local cheesemakers, buy this block of cheese from these people, you know. So it's really making, you know, person-to-person connections. And that is economic. You know, that is a new economy evolving. It's also a new politics evolving because it's regional by definition. Because if I'm going to buy cheese from a cheesemaker, you know, he's going, or she very often she is going to be close by. So in the book again, I write about what I call disaster democracy. So because, you know, Naomi Klein's book Disaster Capitalism, where, do you know that book, Gabriela?
From Naomi Klein? Sorry.
Naomi Klein's book, Disaster Capitalism.
Not this one. No.
Okay. So she writes about, you know, when, I mean, for example, sort of, you know, the Indian Ocean tsunami, for example, some major disaster what happens is that, you know, firms go in, predatory firms, saying, oh, you know, we can redevelop the seafront, you know, sort of, and so they work with the government, and the government says, well, no fisherman can go within 200 meters of the seafront because it's dangerous. And then these firms go in and they build hotels on the seafront, you know, so it's affecting change for the worse out of disaster. And I said, but the other thing also happens, which is that there is such a thing as disaster democracy. So, for example, in New Orleans after the floods, I mean, again, food was, you know, the immediate problem for many people. And what happened is these networks grew up literally overnight. People were literally scribbling on bits of paper where they knew there was food available and handing out leaflets to people. And these new food networks developed that still exist now, you know, sort of however long it is, 15 years later. So I think, you know, the kind of, the way people collaborate when there's a crisis, and, you know, that kind of idea that you can be more independent and more local and more cooperative, I think it's just finding ways to actually enable that and to scale it up. So, for example, government, instead of saying, you know, oh, we're going to kind of give, you know, planning permission for supermarkets so the food system can get to all the regions or whatever, you could just say, we're going to have really good, you know, network technology. We're going to provide food hubs, you know, and we're going to support local farmers and try to sort of nurture local networks, for example, and then leave it to local people to run that. I mean, it's very interesting that the most local, I'm talking too much anyway, but I so I'm going to hand over to Sebastien, but spatially, it comes from sort of, you know, it's nested. It's what can be done at the level of a street, at the level of a neighborhood, at the level of a region, and so on. And it's actually enhancing that and giving people as much help as you can to do it themselves, basically. You know, that's how local resilience is built. But I'll hand over to Sebastien.
Thank you.
As you, I think that the crisis of the COVID, or the situation of confinement is an incentive for anyone first to notice all the dependencies in which he's trapped in a way, or incarcerated, and to reflect on these things. It's an opportunity, when the opportunity exists, to try to find other alternatives, small alternatives, to escape this condition of being at the end of a chain of distribution in your apartment. And it's of course, an incentive to realize what is really necessary, the virtues of necessity, of which you speak in your book, and everything. But it's not, I mean, in most situations, I guess, when you're in a city or in the middle of a city, a place where you can start to organize really alternatives. In other places, as in the suburbs where I'm now confined, extreme suburbs of Paris, I can see a lot of people starting to cultivate their lawn already, just next door there. So yes, there is, people are taking in charge a lot of things that they didn't so far, and getting curious about the things, and probably talking at sanitary distance of these things. And yes, it's happening. Now the how is a big question that Nissim was raising, is how, when it's over, if it's over, when do you start, you know, scaling up just a little? But there is this big issue of scale.
Yeah.
That is fundamental, and you seem in the book to have this idea that, of course, at the local level, most of the things should be taken care of. Of course, there are also bigger issues that cannot just be solved by things. It's the precise articulation that gives me pain to really think through. But after the exhibition, after the exhibition, I was thinking that there was something missing badly in our exhibition, which is going deeper into, because we end up with those different scenarios, you know, of more of the same, or the expanding horizontal city, you know, or the infiltration of agriculture into every existing city fabric, or this kind of other secessionist agenda. But there is a whole tradition of also of thinking on what people used to call human scale back in the 70s, Kirkpatrick scale, and on this whole delineation of the good scale and that's very present in your book, in an Aristotelian tradition. What is the scale of relative self-sufficiency that we should call state instead of the...
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, Aristotle, I mean, you and I know this, but maybe not everybody does, but I mean, he goes through this really interesting thought process of basically what the ideal size of a city is. And self-sufficiency is his goal, because he sees that as basic to political independence. And so he says, you want the city to be as small as it can be, as long as it can do everything it needs to do for itself. So this, he actually effectively talks about division of labor, interestingly. You know, so you obviously need shoemakers, and you need metal workers, and you need, you know, philosophers, and, you know, you need farmers. And when you've got all of the people you need, then that's the size the state should be. So it's quite an interesting idea. And I mean, I think, you know, clearly, you know, we've grown up with the nation state. So the nation state to us is just a sort of, you know, it's something we relate to, and it's something that we automatically think about. But it's not necessarily the most effective scale of politics for doing a lot of the things we need to do now. And I mean, I think, you know, well, we'll see if the EU makes it out the other side of COVID-19. I mean, that's going to be a really interesting one. But, you know, I mean, my country tragically has left. I think this is a mistake of historical proportions. I just want to get that out there. But, you know, I mean, it seems to me that, you know, much more nuanced thinking about the nature of political and economic cooperation needs to go on now. And fundamental to all of that has to be, again, as you say, the question of what is a good life, but asked at appropriate scales. I mean, this is why I find, well, I am an architect, so I would, but, you know, I always used to say to my students when they were designing a building, draw it at 1 to 50, draw it at 1 to 200, draw it at 1 to 5,000, you know, draw it at different scales, because, you know, if you do that, you see the problem in a different way. And I think we need to ask the question of what is a good life at different scales, you know, and if you ask it at the question of an individual, as I say, I mean, I just happen to be rather well disposed to reading, gardening and writing and kind of being at home, but I mean, other people aren't comfortable like that. That's completely fine too. But clearly at the scale of a planet, what our current model of a good life is totally inappropriate. It's just not achievable. So it seems to me that we need a new conception of a good life that is achievable. And this is where it comes into thinking like, you know, Sophie Rayworth's donut economic idea, you know, that the West has to sort of pull its horns in a bit, and the sort of the global South needs to expand. And we all meet in this area where, you know, I mean, it's very, very achievable, but we have to make it also desirable to people. And part of that is giving people access to land. You know, so no, you can't have your holiday in the Bahamas because that's ridiculous, and why would you want it anyway? But here's a lovely place to live with a beautiful garden, shared garden, but it's still beautiful. You know, so we can do that, and if we did that, people might want to escape their lives less. You know, or here's a worthwhile, meaningful job. You know, so you don't have to kind of compensate yourself for the fact that you're so miserable by buying 85 pairs of trainers or whatever. You know, it's replacing the consumerist idea of a good life with, if you like, the primary action, hands-on, you know, man, I mean, this is Schumacher's thing, but man the producer. So basically, one of my arguments is making stuff makes us happy. And it's very interesting, again, under COVID-19, people are rediscovering, you know, I mean, it sounds such a cliche, baking, but I mean, you know, people at home baking, again, they're, as you say, Sebastien, growing stuff. You know, this is really the basis of a good life, that it is sustainable and that is available to everybody.
But I'm wondering if COVID will be enough to push us in this direction. In a way, I'm wondering whether the COVID situation we're into now is not just a kind of, that would be a kind of optimistic side of seeing it, a kind of repetition of the scale of individual trapped into their environment and thinking about how they could, given another improve the way they live usually. But it might be a kind of prelude to another crisis, which I think we can see coming, which would be kind of different, but having some similar outcomes, which would be a really bad energy crisis that would make actually moving far away and you know, to do all kinds of stuff much more expensive, and then most of the time almost impossible. That would create a very different situation where you would not be assigned to stay alone, you know, but where indeed you would be more local because it's too expensive to move, and you would have to find other ways to do the things you did easily thanks to cheap, dense energy. So in a way, my best my optimistic view of the COVID situation is it might be a kind of good prelude to reflect on the next step, which will be forced in a way by energy descent.
Yeah, we absolutely need energy descent, of course. And you know, I guess, I mean, I am an optimist. I mean, I in a way see my job as painting a picture of a good life that is attractive and achievable. You know, I mean, in that sense, I'm still being an architect, I suppose. But it's absolutely about being more local and being more rooted in a place. And as I say, there's this kind of payoff that, you know, between the pleasures of being rooted in a place and the pleasures of not being rooted in a place, if you like, you know, and it's a tension. And I think before COVID, this was winning. You know, everyone was just flying everywhere the whole time, you know, and sort of, oh, we don't live anywhere and we're citizens of the world. Now we're discovering actually there's a lot to be gained from belonging somewhere and knowing your neighbours and helping them and the feeling that gives you, you know, and making stuff at home. And, you know, friends of mine are starting to build stuff in the garden, you know. I mean, my editor of the book, she's for the first time in her life started building an allotment, as you say, out the back of her house. She's usually too busy. So I think time is the thing that COVID has given us. And it is the great, great compensation for giving up this dashing around lifestyle that wasn't making us happy anyway. And it's about achieving a balance anyway. It's not like saying you can never fly again. It's saying flying is a really damaging, luxurious thing to do that you shouldn't expect to do, you know, more than once every 5 years, but that's fine. You know, we can do this. This is fine. You know, I mean, we're all talking across Europe. I mean, this is a brilliant thing for people to be discovering they can do, I think. And of course, it's not a substitute for actual human contact, but it's showing how we can achieve that balance. I think that's how I would position it if I was talking to a politician about it and trying to sell it to them as an idea.
You know, Carolyn, that for us in Switzerland, it's soon time to cook. We are a bit later than you, but we will. So I think we'll soon conclude. But before, I think we have maybe we can take one or two last questions, and we have one. I would say difficult question for you, but it's good if I don't know, Daniela, if you are with us, if you want to ask your question.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for the conversation and presentation. Very nice. So my question was, you talk a lot about what is a good life. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about what is a good death? in your Sitopian vision?
Good question
So,
for Carolyn.
It's a brilliant question. Thank you very much, Daniela. It's a brilliant question. Actually, my final chapter is all about this. It's called Time. And as I said earlier, it's about coming to terms with the fact that we are mortal and therefore mortality. And I'm very interested in the Stoics. The Stoics, which is a tradition in the West, which I think is very similar to Buddhism in the East. It's about being in the here and now. And the fundamental idea was to accept the fact that you're going to die sometime. You know, just face this horrible truth, get it out the way, and they have many sort of mechanisms for doing this, and then live every day of your life as if it's the last day of your life, you know. So it's kind of removing, I mean, death is a normal part of the process of being alive. It's what happens. I mean, another thing about being involved in food and in plants and stuff is you see the annual cycle, and you realize that by eating, you are a part of that cycle. So for me, it's really simple, actually. A good death is one where you have already accepted the fact that you're going to die. And, you know, ideally, you've accepted it all your life. You know, so it's not this horrible, scary thing, but it's actually a normal part of life. And it's one where you look back on your life and you think you've lived well. You know, and this is another thing that the Stoics are very big on, is if you live every day as if it's your last, you will make the most of your life. So they have this saying, carpe diem, you may have heard of, seize the day. Is don't put it off till next week, do it now, you know. So, and it's about celebrating as well. So the whole tradition of the carnival, you know, which is interestingly also celebrating death, and it comes at a time of year when nature is dying before the rebirth of Easter. You know, it's also about celebrating the fact that you are part of a natural cycle. So, I mean, a good death in that sense for me is one, and obviously, you know, ideally it's at home, surrounded by people you love as well. Hopefully not in pain. I mean, fortunately, we have incredible medicines now that allow us to more or less float off on a sea of morphine towards the end. But I've seen people have good deaths and I've seen people have bad deaths. And the ones that had a good death are those who accepted death. And funnily enough, you know, my father was a doctor and he'd seen so many people die in his life. He was totally accepting of it. It was just like, my time's come. And it was a very good death as a result of that. So I think that's another thing that COVID-19 weirdly is forcing us to do, is to accept our mortality, but hopefully that makes us treasure life all the more. And that's what the Stoics argued, and I really believe that.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay, so there is a question that can be interesting for us who are in the School of Architecture, Archizoom, from Theo Beichmann, Carolyn, who is asking how your research on food is influencing your practice as an architect.
That's a lovely question, and I'm really sorry to say that it's not, because actually I've become a full-time writer at the moment. So I haven't given up being an architect deliberately, but I did write, well, actually Sitopia and the last half of Hungry City full-time. I am still a director of a practice in London. I keep kind of hoping that people are going to ask me to design something. If they did, so I can answer your question in the kind of in the theoretical, it would be very much to look at any project that I was given, because any architecture project is ultimately for humans. You know, it may also be for nature and for animals, but there are going to be people there. And I would ask, how are the people who are going to inhabit this building or use it, how are they going to eat? You know, where is the food they're going to eat come from? Will that food have made a better world or a bad world? You know, will it have made a landscape more or less beautiful, more or less fertile? Will it have paid people well or not well? You know, will it have sort of simply built a good Sitopia or a bad Sitopia, in my terminology? And it's amazing if you do that, then you have to ask a series of very difficult questions. And again, at any scale, as I say, so this would apply as much if I was designing a museum, to if I was designing a housing estate, to if I was designing a factory. It's all the same. And obviously it's most interesting at the scale of a city or a city region, because then it's all about, as I say, my mantra is now, maximizing the urban-rural interface, which could also be maximizing the interface between social clusters and nature. And it can happen, as I say, at any scale. So I would never design a flat without a balcony or very big windows or access to a garden. I would never design a housing estate without thinking about the food, and ideally linking it to growing spaces, ideally linking it to local food networks, maybe creating a local food hub. I mean, just design for the food and everything else follows. Because if people eat well, they live well. It really is that simple. That's the beauty of food. You're thinking about life, as I keep saying, but it's actually there physically in front of you. So it doesn't have to be abstract. So that would be how it would affect the way I would design if I was lucky enough to do some design.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I think that after architecture, we can finish with a question from Marine, who maybe change the scale. And it's a question that is really for Carolyn and Sebastien together. I don't know, Marine, if you want to ask your question directly.
Yes, I can. Actually, I'm an architect, but I don't want to build stuff. So I'm working more in the urbanism and landscape and regional scale. So that is the link with my question, because I'm really obsessed with this region scale based on ecological aspect, not the good governance or political stuff. So that's why I'm wondering, why are you still speaking about city? The older book was about city, and here you have a chapter about city. Why city instead of region? And that is also, I think, a reflection Sebastien has as well about bioregion or regionalism. We already speak a bit about that, actually. So I'm really interesting. Why are you still choosing to speak about cities instead of regions?
Well, I mean, actually, the 5th chapter in my book is called City and Country. So if you like, it is about the region. And, for me, I mean, Hungry City, the first book, I mean, that was deliberately a provocative title, because if the city's hungry, its food doesn't come from the city, it comes from somewhere else. So again, the region is implied in the title. And again, it's meant to be provocative, because Hungry City is like cities are voracious and they eat everything up. And actually, my entire philosophy, funnily enough, is about putting the idea back in our heads that we don't dwell in cities, in fact, we dwell in nature. So I guess it's my way of, shall we say, polemicizing the problem, but very much, the city and country. Yeah, I mean, if you go back to this drawing, it just came from these radiating scales. I don't know if you can actually see that, but this is the region. It's all the region. And I guess if most people live in cities now. So if you sort of go from your plate of soup out, then, the city is just a sort of a layer that you encounter before you encounter a thing out there called countryside, beyond which is nature. And I do actually argue in the book for thinking in terms of regions. And I mean, I guess I'm trying to achieve a balance in people's heads between city and country. And I'm saying we need both of those. And then beyond it, we need nature, and we dwell in all of it. So I am making that argument, in fact. Maybe not so much today, because we didn't talk about my nature chapter very much at all, where I talk about this kind of thing a lot.
Yeah. And well, I said it a few minutes earlier. I think it's, in fact, indeed missing dimension, in my case, in the exhibition, not to have gone further into that regionalist idea and its history. This is what we are working on.
The next one.
No, but these are, because of course, as you explain in both books, in a way, for instance, the Greek polis didn't mean absolutely just the houses or what we call the city, but meant actually the city and the country there. But today, of course, we are not used to think like that. We think city and of course, in the scenario that we described as secession, there is the idea, I mean, there is this agenda of finding some kinds of alternatives to city-centered regions, right? Where the region would be some kind of a polis. And now the big issue is what scale? Is it a watershed? Is it a series of watershed? Is it what? You know? I'm really interested, but we're working on these things, looking at these traditions. Right? And it's, I think, a fantastic chantier today. So it's great that, Marine, you're working on it
too. Absolutely. No, I mean, I think we, you know, I argue a lot in both my books against this kind of city-centric thinking, actually. And I am a Londoner. I was born and bred in central London. I still live in central London. But I'm very against this city-centric thinking. I'm very strongly arguing against it, actually.
Since we're on this, I would like to know, have you read David Fleming?
No.
Who is this really interesting guy, English guy who died 10 years ago and published, he didn't publish it actually, he was published by one of his disciples in like 3 years ago, a big book called Lean Logic, a dictionary for the future and how to survive it.
Yeah, I actually have this book. You know, it's really weird. I have this book. In fact, it's right there.
Yeah.
But I, isn't that funny? But and it looked really amazing.
Yeah.
But you know how some books just find you. I mean, I looked at it, went, oh my god, this looks amazing, amazing, and then my path didn't take me through it.
Of course.
But
you were finishing.
I will. It's going to. I'll have a look.
It's a mine of reflections that get really rid of the idea of the city. I mean, of course, he's kind of projecting himself into the result of collapses, diverse collapses, but really rethinking, trying to imagine what would be, notably, a life and a politics without cities.
I'm really glad you said that now, because if you'd have said it before and I'd have read it, you know, so when you're writing a book, sometimes if you read a book that's too close to your book, it can mess with your head, because you just end up wanting to say everything they said. So maybe this is perfect timing. I think something magical just happened.
You'll see, it's a very, very interesting book that oscillates between conservatism and other stuff, which is a major influence, for instance, for the transition town movement. In fact, weirdly, it may have been Rob Hopkins who put me onto it. Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great. That's my next reading sorted. Okay. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Sebastien.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you to everybody for coming to this discussion. I hope you, and really, I recommend reading those two books by Carolyn. They are wonderfully written, wonderfully crafted, as you saw. They are three-dimensional, as you saw, and it's full of incredible lessons of wisdom, not smartness.
It's incredibly kind of you. Thank you. I mean, it's been wonderful to have this conversation with so many lovely people. Wonderful, you know, to meet you again, Sebastien, this time at a distance, because we do think very similarly, and I hope we can do this again for real around a table with a lovely glass of chilled wine soon. And lovely to meet you too, Cyril, and thank you so much for hosting us. And, you know, thanks to everyone for, giving us a couple of hours of your late, is it Friday? Yeah, Friday afternoon. And thanks to everyone.
We put all the microphone on to flip clap now.
Thank you. Ciao. Stay well. Bye.